Welcome, everyone, to this edition of the Doorstep podcast. I'm your co-host, Senior Fellow at the Carnegie Council, Nick Gvosdev.
And I'm Tatiana Serafin, also Senior Fellow here at Carnegie, welcoming in a moment Professors Maria Popova and Oxana Shevel to speak about Russia and Ukraine, Entangled, Histories, Diverging States. It is their new book and a new look at the history of Russia and Ukraine, and such an important discussion ahead of the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. Welcome back, Nick, to the podcast. You've been traveling and listening to folks about what's going on. Share with us some of your thoughts ahead of the second anniversary.
I think that we're coping with the fact that some of our expectations 2 years ago about how quickly this would be wrapped up and how quickly it would be wrapped up in Ukraine's favor are being challenged. The U.S. assumed that Russia would be much more crippled by economic sanctions, that there would be this massive wave of aid from the United States, and that Europe would be able to step up, and that the United States was committed, as President Biden said on many occasions, to do what it would take. And we're finding today in 2024 that all of those assumptions are being questioned at a time when, and I think this is really tied to Maria's and Oksana's book, that people still have mental maps that don't quite extricate Ukraine from Russia. And therefore, when things maybe aren't going as well as we would have hoped, it becomes easier to think about ceasefires, stalemates, concessions. And I think that this is critical to hear this perspective from our guests about the processes that are ongoing in Ukraine, and particularly the changes in how Ukrainians are viewing their struggle. Effectively, it's a second war for independence. And to do this against a backdrop of, particularly at a Munich security conference this past week, where there is a sense that the West can't do it, or a lack of confidence in the ability of the major Western democracies to deal with change. And I think that our guests are also going to be addressing some of the sources of those beliefs, and I'm looking forward to our conversation with them.
Let's hear from Maria and Oksana now. Thank you so much, Maria and Oksana, for joining us today on this pivotal day, a few days before the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine by Russia, to speak about your book, Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States, which is such a great read for those of us who may be getting disinformation from certain media outlets, who may not understand the conflict, who may have flipped through it on social media really quickly. But you lay out not only the history in such a succinct way, but you bring it forward to what it means today. And I think, I'd like to start out for what it means for today, because we also just had the maybe expected but still shocking murder of Alexei Navalny. And we have this anniversary, and we have perhaps nuclear arms in space. So much going on. If you were to write, what is happening today, epilogue to this book, what would you say that we need to think about, considering all that's happened this week?
It's a really, really good question. I think we would emphasize that the divergence between Russia and Ukraine that we outline in the book that took place over the last 30 years, the gap is wider than ever. Russia has slid back even further into repression. You may have thought in 22, how much worse can it get? Apparently, it can get even worse. And Ukraine continues to be very committed to avoiding reincorporation into the Russian world. So the gap, not only is it not bridged over these 2 years, it grew even wider. And so when we think about how this um, situation could be resolved and how there could be lasting peace of some sort, we have to absolutely let go of ideas that there will be, or of the let go of sort of the wishful thinking that there could be some kind of compromise, meeting halfway, some sort of reconciliation. Really, we have to understand, be very clear-eyed, that Ukraine is trying to extricate itself from the Russian world. And the question that we're facing now is, are we going to help them or not? And what part of Ukraine would be able to extricate itself?
Yeah, I would totally agree with everything Maria said. I would just add that one of the kind of what the drivers of the divergence between Russia and Ukraine in our story is different identity politics and sort of interpretation of, where the boundaries of one nation end and begin. And I think Putin made it clear repeatedly since the invasion that he does not recognize a sovereign Ukrainian nation. In fact, the rhetoric became even more genocidal, that, these people are really Russians, and whoever disagrees is a Nazi. So it is really not, as Maria said, the possibility for some sort of compromise, meeting in the middle, is just not there. So yes, in a way that the story of the divergence that we tell accelerates since February 2022.
I wanted to pick up on that theme of extrication and bring it both to your experiences since writing the book, your interactions with media, with policymakers. I think one of the criticisms, and I think it's a very valid criticism, is that in the wake of the invasion, you had media outlets that essentially took their Moscow correspondents and dropped them in Kiev, and essentially sort of said, "Well, we'll take you from Moscow and the Kremlin, and we'll just drop you here, and somehow you will still have a sense of what's happening." And that for policymakers, it still does seem that, along with Putin, that they have this image, this map, this mental border in which the Soviet border is still operating, as opposed to thinking of Ukraine, Poland, Hungary, Germany as really a Central European continuum. In the work that you've been doing, in the advice that you've been giving to media, to policymakers, and others in terms of your engagement, how are you finding this notion of extrication? That this is, in fact, a policy goal, that the old Soviet border is gone, that there is a border between Russia and Ukraine that is not sort of soft or malleable, or it's really all sort of the same thing moving forward. How are you finding when you're interacting with people, how people are conceptualizing, as you said, this notion of that the end goal is the extrication of Ukraine from not only the Russian world, but given some of the footage that we see from Ukraine with the old hammer and sickle coming back, it's not only just seemingly the Russian world, but it's also a kind of reborn Soviet Union as well. So your thoughts on that?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and maybe I'll start just kind of on this extrication point. You put it very well in the question about mental maps, right? Like, how do people think of this part of the world? Like, what one of our colleagues actually asked students to draw like a map of Europe. So, where's Ukraine on the mental map of Europe? And it's one thing to say that, of course, unless people are really on the fringe, I mean, the idea that there are international borders, that they matter, is there. But then when you think about sort of, do people really think these borders kind of make sense, right? And need to be preserved. And then it sort of we get into this question, well, Ukrainians and Russians, they're kind of similar. There was like a lot of close history and commonalities and all of this. And that's of course true, but also there was history that was suppressed systematically by the Soviet and Tsarist Empire. So this notion, for example, that Ukraine was an independent state after the Bolshevik Revolution, that the Bolsheviks crushed, right? Many people don't know that. We can go even further in history. So Ukraine to extricate itself of Ukrainian political class at the time and population were just suppressed, and people simply don't know it. So then it's like, well, you were together for 300 years. So all of these narratives that Tsarist and Soviet and now Putin continues to push, they're really deeply held. So I think, hopefully the book that even though ours is not a history book, we do go over these different interpretations of past events as either sort of a spin that would try to underscore this narrative of centuries-old unity, or deconstruction of these spins and saying, well, actually, look, here there was a period of time, there were political leaders that tried to extricate Ukraine from Russian rule. So I think it's important, and historians, of course, are doing much more of this important education. So that's one kind of part of this extrication analysis that I would put forth.
One thing I would add here is I think there has been some progress over the last 2 years in the media sort of grasping that Ukraine and Russia are two different states, different nations. But what I'm struggling with now in conversations with the media is sort of challenging this deeply held assumption that whatever Ukraine may want ideally is not achievable because Russia is just too big and too strong and cannot possibly be defeated. And now, as the second anniversary of the full-scale invasion is coming up, I am talking to journalists who want to write op-eds that recap the situation, that literally call Putin unstoppable. And so, I try to explain, look, they have not actually made significant gains in a whole year. Just because Putin is powerful enough to murder a prisoner. I mean, would I call this unstoppable? No, not necessarily. The West is dropping the ball on aid. That's why things are looking so dire. But I think that's an important dimension that also is related to whether Ukraine will be able to extricate itself, not just being perceived as rightfully belonging to a Russian sphere of influence, which is one problem, but also perceiving the situation as immutable, inevitable, cannot be solved.
Yeah, I think just yesterday I saw an opinion poll from a number of countries. Actually, was published in Ukrainian media, and the comments under the posts from Ukrainians are kind of they're upset. Only I think 10% of the population believes in the surveyed countries believe that Ukraine can win. Right, 10%. So something like 70% support it, but only 10% believe that it can win. So just to illustrate the point Maria was making.
Exactly.
I saw that poll too, and that upset me as well. But I think it has to do with the word that you bring up, the narrative aspect of, like it's this extension of, I'm going to say, big brother, the little country there. And also, as part of this narrative is this disinformation campaign that Russia has really kind of ramped up. And it's getting traction in particular parts of the U.S. media. Tucker Carlson going to Russia to interview Putin and getting a whole lot of press about that. And I do think that this is in 2 years, you mentioned gaps, and there's this media gap, between left and right outlets, and it's increasingly politicized here in the U.S. I'm not sure if it's the same divergence in European media and politics, but certainly here we see it. And I'm curious because it's such a flip. 2 years ago, we were talking about Putin being ill. There were pictures of him dying, right? There was this whole weak narrative that it was going to be, over soon because he was so weak. And it's completely flipped. And I'm wondering if you can pinpoint in your research what was that inflection point? Because that's what I'm thinking. What was that when did that narrative shift? I don't think it's just today. I think it's been building. Was it when, the march on Moscow failed? I mean, what is that tweak and shift, and how can we counter it?
Yeah, this is an excellent question. It seems that the inflated expectations about the counteroffensive were part of the inflection point. People really expected to see more major cities liberated and didn't pay attention to the successes in the Black Sea. And obviously also didn't didn't pay attention to the fact that Ukraine launched this counteroffensive with only modest military aid from us, not with full backing. Even though I remember in the summer, I was hearing analysts say things like, we have given the Ukrainians everything, let's see what they achieve. Well, once you set it up like that, without mentioning that they have no air superiority, without mentioning that the long-range missiles are not there, without mentioning that they are limited in where they can strike, really, should you be saying we've equipped them with everything? No, but I think that was part of why sort of people drew the conclusion, well, we gave them the absolute best shot and it didn't work. It must mean that Russia is just too strong.
Yeah, that is true. I guess just one thing that I would add, I think also part of the problem with media, and that's maybe kind of media in general, is that the focus is on the very immediate, right? Like whatever is kind of hot and happening today, then that's what the media focuses on. But we really need like broader perspective, right? I mean, if we think about, say, the situation, even parallels with Second World War, right? Things maybe didn't look that great for Britain in 1940. Was that the reason to say like, okay, let's throw in the towel, which many are saying now, right? Because clearly the danger from Putin prevailing in Ukraine is very long-term, very severe, right? And that has to be sort of, if somebody is a journalist writing about it today, like, and, they captured another town and Ukrainians didn't capture that, like you have to also think about the costs and the benefits and the dangers over the long term, and at least contextualize, today's coverage with these broader questions in mind. And that is sometimes is done, but very often is not done.
Yeah, I think the problems, and let me know if you're seeing the problem with contextualization and trying to, is that what you're saying, this immediacy of a social media image is so powerful, and people, in the immediacy of the beginning of the war, saw Zelensky in his fatigues and were so inspired. Everybody started copying how he dressed, right? He was eloquent. There was this like Zelensky effect on everything. It was this glow, right? And I don't know if it's media fatigue, right? Other events around the world have eclipsed it, or if it's literally the medium of delivery, that seeing an image on Instagram, you quickly forget it. There is no kind of there's no memory instilled. You see an image, you like it, and then you move on. And I wonder if this is really hurting Ukrainians who really leaned into social media 2 years ago. But if the management of it now doesn't seem to be the same. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I don't know. I think, like, in a way, I would agree that, everything that Tatiana, you just said, that how media reacts, I mean, the impact of social media. but on the other hand, like what would we want Ukrainians to do different, to have some different spin on Zelensky? I mean, it seems to me that the effort really should be on things that really matter, right? Also on the battlefield. So in a way, like, yeah, I mean, I'm sure there are some PR companies that could think of, this and the other way. But ultimately, also sort of speaking as an academic, I think what other non-media people do is so important, right? The interviews that we give, the analysis that people write, right? Like what the teachers teach in the classroom. So we shouldn't be driven just by social media, and to some extent it's going to be inevitable, but I think there is a lot of work to be done, not to kind of manage social media better, but do all this other work that we try to do with our book, that we try to do in the interviews and our conversations with students, that you do in your podcast and other appearances. And I think that's kind of where the context also comes in.
Well, and just on that, I think maybe also it's less that what Ukrainians should have done or not done. My concern, I think, is that people in the West on social media who really thought that by really playing things up, they were helping the situation, I think, in fact, created these inflated expectations. And then sometimes well-meaning analysts in the West really sort of laying out, Crimea by summer of 2023, and that it's not that, Ukraine did something, a social media strategy, but that in some ways it was, Ukraine's friends in the West on social media that created such an expectation for 2023, the counteroffensive, and perhaps as you said, I believe it was you, Maria, who said, look, a lot of the aid wasn't in fact delivered. A lot was promised, not so much was delivered, and yet you had so many people on social media saying, wall of steel, when the Leopards show up and the Bradleys show up, we're really going to see something differently. And that in some ways, the finger really should be pointed at us for inflating expectations for Ukraine and now complaining that Ukraine hasn't met them on the timeline that we would prefer.
Yeah, it's a really, really tough balance to strike right, because on the one hand, the talk about, Crimean beach party was in a way necessary in order to make people see that it is possible for Ukraine to liberate Crimea, that it's not the red line that's going to destroy the world that Russia seeks to communicate. So on the one hand, you have to push these maximalist sort of great outcomes because you want to get it into people's heads that this is plausible, that it could happen. But it has the effect, if you do it too much, if you kind of overpromise it, then it sets you up for a disappointment. But it is almost a damned if you do, damned if you don't kind of situation that is impacted by this really deeply ingrained idea of Russia as all powerful that is kind of clouding and hovering over all the assessments.
Do you think among the younger generations the narrative has changed? Because we talk a lot about Gen Z and what they're thinking as they rise into political positions and into decision-making positions at organizations. Groups here, Razom, for example, Ukrainian group run by millennials and Gen Z, is really driving the lobbying efforts here in the U.S. Is this younger generation the generation we should look to for change in Ukraine, in terms of just creating this new image of Ukraine in the world? And then similarly in Russia, I worry because of the lack of outside information coming in and the narratives that Russian media is spewing, what is happening to the younger Russian generation?
Yeah, the generation question is interesting because, on the one hand, the younger people clearly, they don't have the same sort of legacies, right? They didn't grow up in the Cold War, but then again, whatever they read in the history books or here on social media can have even like more of an effect. And sometimes people may know very little, but they would seize on like one thing. I'll just, very briefly, kind of your question made me think of this example from my child's middle school when they did like a borders project, and I looked at a few of the responses that students wrote, sixth grade, about the causes of the war. And several of them said, Russia invaded because NATO was expanding. Like, where did they get this idea, right? They like probably Googled it, and I was talking with Maria about it. I was like, where is this coming from? They probably got Mia Scheimer's interview, right? And they're like, okay. I mean, in sixth grade, it's okay, right? I mean, hopefully in higher school they will, be invited to think more critically, even though in sixth grade they should be doing that too. But this sort of like, I guess what I'm trying to say that the just somebody's age only takes you so far as an explanation, right? Because it is what these people are going to learn and where they're going to learn it from. And in a way, these stereotypes could still be perpetuated, right? So nobody is immune to them. It's more that like we would like to hope that now, especially in the last 2 years, as Maria is saying, there is much more kind of discussion about Ukraine and Ukrainian history and this difference and the identity and all of these things. And people are not necessarily ideologically wedded to some younger people, to some alternative narrative, so they can certainly be educated, invited to think about it, and all of this. And in Russia, again, I don't know, the generation by itself only takes you so far. And as you said, that if information is limited, but even before when the information was not limited, I think this kind of imperial mindset towards Ukraine on the part of even younger Russians it wasn't there. It's partly again the message you get in school, the message you get at home, this notion that centuries old unity and all of this is there. And now that there are few alternative sources of information, we have, I would say, less reason to think that just generational change in Russia somehow mysteriously would solve, say, the problems that existed in the relations and that underlined ultimately leading to this conflict.
Yeah, one thing I'll add about the Western Gen Z is that one of the dangers that I see is that the knowledge base about the Cold War and about what the communist regimes looked like is not there to the same extent, right? They have no personal recollections of this being discussed. So it seems that Gen Z is a bit more of a fertile ground uh, for for really kind of falling for the idea that maybe the Soviet Union was a progressive and anti-colonial force, and maybe the the restoration of it wouldn't be so bad. There's some basics on the Soviet Union that I think are missing, and as a result, I mean, we also know that young people tend to be, I forgot what the exact phrase was, but if you're not a communist in your teens, you're not. I forgot how it goes, but anyway, younger people are supposed to lean there, and so without the knowledge there to be about what these communist regimes actually looked like, it becomes kind of a reservoir for potential understanding of where Russia's coming from.
Yeah, I completely agree with you, which is why your book is so important. So I want to, again, show Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States, because context is important, history is important, and we need to be discussing these things as we look forward too. So what, from your vantage point of writing this book and looking at what's happening now, what can we expect looking ahead in 2024 over the next year? Across the globe, there are elections in, most of the democracies. Over half the world, I think, is the statistic, is going to be voting this year. huge election here in the US that may really change policy. What are you most worried about, and what are you looking forward to in 2024? Where should we be looking for information? So, three-part question.
Okay, well, maybe I'll just start on the what can we expect and what we should be looking for and being afraid. I think one thing that, and again, it goes to our discussion of the kind of underestimation of Ukraine and overestimation of Russia. I think one thing we can definitely expect that in Ukraine, this determination to free itself from Russian world and be a sovereign, independent, democratic state is going to be there. So this notion, this just sort of troubles me in many accounts. It's like Ukraine can be made to do X, Y, and Z. I think we should not be thinking this way, and we should be acknowledging Ukrainian agency, hopefully admiring what Ukrainians are doing. But even if one is, leans the other way, I think this notion that somehow Ukraine can be made to do stuff, that just given where current popular support is, that people want to see victory, they want to see the homeland liberated. I think there was a recent poll from Ukraine just a couple of days ago that showed that only 4% of the population, 4%, would find acceptable a settlement where Russia gets to keep the territory it occupied, right? So it's not some sort of this narrative that this Zelensky is doing something against the will of the Ukrainian people, which is, again, part of the narrative. It's just simply wrong. So I think that is, in a way, both kind of encouraging, right? Because clearly the hardship has been very severe, and the toll on the society and the state has been very severe, and yet this determination to be free, to be democratic, is there. And the things to worry about, just as you said, the elections that are coming up, I think things are looking pretty, dire now. The aid stuck in Congress, and if somebody like Trump is elected in this country, and more populist leaders elected in Western Europe, I mean, that would make this challenge all the more severe. So that's something I personally kind of worry about. So I'm sure Maria will have things to add.
Yeah, I think, and drawing actually on what we argue in the book, one of the biggest fears for me is that the West will basically return to its usual policy since '91, which has been accommodating Russia and seeking good relations and sort of hoping the best for Russia's political development, and thinking that Russia has these sort of legitimate interests in the region, so to speak. And we thought in 2022, and there was a lot of talk, in Germany about the Zeitenwende, sort of this radical reassessment, this opening of the eyes that we now see that Russia is expansionist, etc. And I'm afraid that we're seeing this kind of dissipate and crumble, and the actually normal policy for the West throughout the last 30 years, contrary to what Mearsheimer may tell you about how the West was humiliating Russia, the exact opposite. We show it in the book. The West was constantly bending over backwards to accommodate Russia. And I'm afraid that a Trump presidency will usher more of that.
Well, we hope to continue this conversation with you and to see what will happen. Thank you for being with us on this eve of the anniversary of the second, I call it the second invasion of Ukraine by Russia, because of course things began in 2014. I know we didn't get a chance to talk about that, but you can read about it in this great book, Russia and Ukraine, Entangled Histories, Diverging States, by Maria Popova and Oxana Shevel. Thank you so much.
Thank you.